Welcome to Private Fame. Tonight's story is about Tupac Shakur. Not the icon, not the conspiracy, but the man who lived between poetry and paranoia. From street corners to global stages, his voice was everywhere, in lyrics, headlines, and courtroom whispers. He wasn't just famous, he was a symbol. But what does it feel like to become a legend while you're still alive? And not sure how long that will last. If you're staying with me tonight, like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, and what time your night begins. He was born into prophecy. Not the kind wrapped in mysticism or religious reverence, but the kind that emerges from pain, from struggle, from blood and fire. Lassane Parish Crooks, later known to the world as Tupac Amaru Shakur, entered life not just as a child of his mother, Afeni, but as a product of her war. She was a Black Panther, a revolutionary, a woman who carried her politics in her breath and her son in her womb during a trial that could have ended her freedom. From the very beginning, Tupac was surrounded by urgency. Survival wasn't a theory, it was a condition of existence. And maybe that urgency never left him. He grew into his name, Tupac Amaru, an Incan revolutionary executed for resisting colonial forces. He carried that legacy in his bones, in his voice, in his contradiction. He was sharp, tender, militant, magnetic, a poet in a bulletproof vest. He spoke with the cadence of the streets and the soul of someone centuries old. There was always a strange gravity to him, as if he wasn't just from the present, but from every struggle that came before. As if his blood remembered things he never lived, and he wrote not just for himself, but for all who couldn't. From early on, Tupac was never at ease in the world, not in the industry, not in the media, not in his own body. He was lionized, criminalized, politicized, commodified. He was too soft for the hard world and too hard for the soft one. A walking contradiction, he once said, and that contradiction made him real. People didn't love Tupac because he was consistent. They loved him because he was honest, raw, immediate, unpolished. He bled in public so others could feel seen in private. He was beautiful in the way fire is beautiful. Dangerous, alive, impossible to ignore. And then something changed. In the last year of his life, the fire turned frantic. He was recording like a man with sand slipping fast through his fingers. Dozens of tracks. Sometimes 3 or 4 songs a day. Not just singles, whole albums, unreleased verses, alternative takes, raw vocals left in folders and drives like letters never sent. To hear the engineers tell it, there was a kind of breathlessness to it all. He wasn't coasting. He wasn't vibing. He was working. Like he was racing something invisible. Like he knew. And maybe he did. This was 1996. He had just signed with Death Row. He was fresh out of prison. He had entered a different arena now, one where loyalty was currency and the stakes were no longer hypothetical. The East Coast-West Coast feud was no longer just lyrical. It was blood deep. Streets were watching, guns were cocked, people were dying, and the myth of hip-hop had teeth. But Tupac didn't retreat. He stepped deeper in, and he recorded, relentlessly, desperately, obsessively. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about legacy, about leaving behind enough to outlive the silence. You can hear it in those final tracks, not just the anger or the swagger, but the urgency. The way his verses crash forward, breathless, layered with prophecy and paranoia. There's a pulse in those songs that feels faster than normal. A pacing that suggests he knew time was not on his side. And how could he not know? He'd been shot before, watched friends die, felt betrayal in his own circle. He moved with the tension of a man who understood death was not abstract. It was near. It was waiting, maybe even watching. So he recorded, in studios late into the night. On barely any sleep, ideas scribbled, verses freestyled, entire albums assembled like messages for a future he feared he wouldn't see. People around him described him as obsessed, focused, unreachable. Like something was chasing him and he had to outrun it in sound. And perhaps that's what those songs were, a sprint toward immortality, a refusal to go quietly. He once said, "I might not change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the mind that will." That was never just a quote. That was a mission. And missions come with timelines, deadlines, final hours. Tupac didn't die suddenly. He died slowly, long before Vegas, long before that car ride, long before the gunfire. The world just didn't see it, but he knew. And so he kept writing, kept recording, kept trying to leave behind something that couldn't be silenced. His voice, his presence, his defiance, it still lives because of those days, because he raced the clock and didn't stop, because he saw the end coming and faced it head on, mic in hand, heart split open. He didn't die like a man. He died like a storm, loud, unfinished, unforgettable, and the echo still hasn't faded. There's a strange clarity in knowing your time is short. It strips away the pretense, sharpens every decision, and for Tupac, that clarity bled into every syllable, every beat, every unfinished idea. He wasn't just recording to make hits, he was recording to leave behind a version of himself untouched by caskets, courts, and media spin. The studio became his shelter, his sanctuary, his confessional booth. Not just a space for sound, but for memory, for myth, for the pieces of himself that couldn't survive the world outside its walls. People around him remember his urgency, not as panic, but as precision. He was intentional, tireless, at times almost cold in his discipline. No wasted takes, no hesitation. He'd write verses in minutes, step into the booth, and deliver with the conviction of a man delivering final words. Producers barely had time to catch up. Sessions blurred together, sleepless, caffeine-fueled, crackling with tension. There were no celebrations, no pauses, just track after track, his voice layered into history before it even happened. But that drive didn't come from ambition alone. It came from fear. Fear of being erased, of being misunderstood, of being murdered and misquoted in the same breath. Tupac had always wrestled with death, not as an idea, but as a shadow that followed him. From the bullet wounds to the betrayal that left him bleeding in a hallway, while former allies looked the other way. To the mugshots, the trials, the headlines that tried to paint him in black and white. He knew that even if he escaped death physically, he could still be buried. By public opinion, by distortion, by silence. And so he chose the only weapon that lasted longer than flesh, voice. He poured himself into microphones with a kind of sacred rage. Not just anger at the system, but anger at time, at how little of it he had and how much of it had already been stolen. In his final months, he recorded like someone possessed not by ego, but by legacy. He was building a future without himself in it. There's an eerie poetry in that. He would name albums like The Dawn Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, hinting at resurrection, at prophecy, at the end before the end. He would speak in interviews about dying young, about being taken out, about not making it to 30. And yet, he wasn't paralyzed by fear. He created through it. Like a man who had accepted the countdown and chose to fill the space between each second with meaning. And that meaning wasn't always clean. His final verses were messy, contradictory, glorious in their intensity. One moment, he was tender, poetic, reflecting on love and loss. The next, he was incendiary, lashing out, declaring war, naming names. He knew that truth wasn't neat. It was jagged, and he didn't flinch from that. He didn't censor himself for the sake of image. He said what he needed to say. And fast, because you can't edit the truth when death is closing in. You can only capture it raw. The people closest to him, producers, engineers, friends, say he often looked exhausted. Not just from the work, but from the weight of carrying a message that the world wasn't ready to hear. He wasn't trying to be a star anymore. He was trying to be remembered right. He knew that others would try to finish the story after he was gone. He knew his name would be twisted, politicized, commodified. So he left behind a flood of his own testimony. Vaults of verses, notebooks full of scribbled prophecy. He recorded not just music, but evidence of who he was, of what he felt, of what he saw coming. And then, one night in Las Vegas, it stopped. The car, the intersection, the window rolling down, the shots. But what's haunting is this. He had already recorded his goodbye. Not just once. Dozens of times. In layers. In metaphors. In rage and vulnerability and prophecy. His final days weren't a fade out. They were a crescendo. A scream recorded in real time, knowing it might be the last one. That's why his voice never left. Why he's still quoted, sampled, analyzed. Not because we won't let him go, but because he never let go. He refused to die in silence. He refused to be still. He worked until the very end, not because he had to, but because he knew. The world was going to write his ending, so he wrote everything first. Even now, decades after his death, it feels like Tupac never fully left. His voice is still embedded in the culture. Not just in music, but in language. In protest. In memory. He didn't just make songs. He left evidence. Tracks that pulse with unfinished sentences. Ideas that still feel half alive. Like the man who recorded them never meant for them to be final. He was documenting a state of war. Against the system. Against betrayal. Against the ticking of his own clock. And in those final months, that war intensified. He wasn't just recording to stay relevant. He was recording to outlive the stories that were already being written about him instead of by him. You can hear it in the way his lyrics became sharper, denser, less concerned with metaphor and more concerned with memory. He was naming names, building allegiances, burning bridges with the same urgency as a man crossing them. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. That's the chilling part. He sounded like a man who knew time wasn't just short. It was nearly up. There's footage from his last interviews where his eyes look tired, but his words are clear, fast, relentless. He speaks like someone who doesn't expect to be asked again. There's no performance, no vanity, just raw urgency. A flood of thought. He says he's not afraid to die, but he's afraid to be misunderstood. And maybe that fear was the engine behind those final studio sessions. So he kept recording, at all hours, with anyone who could keep up, track after track, verse after verse, some of it planned, some of it improvised, some of it prophetic in ways that still rattle the spine. His producers have said it felt like he was trying to archive himself, to preserve pieces of his soul and sound. As if he knew the man would go, but maybe the message could remain. And that message wasn't always easy to carry. Because Tupac wasn't simple. He was not one thing. He could be compassionate and brutal in the same verse. He could praise women and curse them. He could speak about peace and then promise retaliation. He was a young man raised inside a storm, political, cultural, emotional. And he never pretended to be pure. He wasn't building a saint. He was building a record of what it meant to live fast, to love recklessly, to fear nothing and still sleep with one eye open. He didn't care about perfection. He cared about permanence. That's why he didn't wait to polish things. That's why he recorded in rapid fire, barely pausing between songs. His albums were puzzles left to be completed by the future. He knew his legacy wouldn't be controlled by him, but he could at least seed it, guide it, bury enough of himself in the vault so that no one could fully rewrite him. It's why posthumous Tupac has lived on longer than most artists' entire careers. The archive he left behind wasn't a coincidence. It was an act of resistance. A man who knew his body was vulnerable, so he made his voice immortal. And now, we still hear him. In protest chants, in street murals, in courtroom speeches, in headphones in cities he never walked through. He's been gone for more than 2 decades, and yet somehow it still feels like he's talking directly to the world now. That's because his urgency wasn't only about death, it was about time. He wasn't trying to survive just his moment. He was trying to speak to ours. That's what makes his final days so haunting. They weren't tragic in the way tabloids describe. They were tragic because he knew. And he moved anyway. He worked anyway. He recorded not out of hope, but out of a deeper knowing. The work must survive, even if the man does not. He raced the clock with headphones on. He made his final stand not on a stage, not in a courtroom, not in a car, but behind a microphone, where he could say exactly what he meant, where no one could interrupt, where no one could spin it before it was captured. And what he left behind wasn't a goodbye. It was a warning, a journal, a fire still burning, still unfinished, still alive. What Tupac left behind wasn't neat. It wasn't polished. It wasn't easy to digest or simple to categorize. It was chaotic, defiant, overflowing, like him. It pulsed with contradictions. Tenderness alongside fury, poetry tangled with violence, street code laced with revolutionary thought. He was the son of a Black Panther, but also a product of the system she fought. He was both victim and threat, both teacher and soldier, both healer and hurricane. And that duality followed him into every booth he entered, especially in those final months. He didn't hide from it. He used it. One moment he was crafting verses about betrayal and death and revenge. The next, he was spilling truth about his mother, about being a black man in America, about love and pain and what it meant to grow up feeling hunted. His voice was never just a delivery system. It was the wound and the weapon, the prayer and the protest, the scar and the scripture. And inside that urgency was something even deeper, a legacy being written in real time, with no guarantee it would survive him. That's what people miss when they talk about how prolific Tupac was before he died. It wasn't just about quantity. It wasn't even about outworking everyone else. It was about documenting, making sure there would be no question about who he was, what he saw, what he carried. He didn't trust the media. He didn't trust the industry. He didn't trust that they'd ever tell the truth about him. So he told it himself. Not once. Not twice. Hundreds of times across albums, freestyles, handwritten notes, interviews, unreleased footage. He wasn't building a career. He was leaving instructions for how to live, how to fight, how to remember, how to hurt and still speak, how to see the system for what it is and refuse to bow. And that's why his final recordings sound the way they do. They don't feel produced in the traditional sense. They feel like dispatches from the front lines. Even when they're about sex or money or power, there's something beneath the surface, buzzing, rushing, reminding you. This man doesn't think he has time, because maybe he didn't. He said it himself, in interviews, in lyrics, in passing. If I die tonight, I might not make it. I know they coming. These weren't just rhetorical flourishes. They were realities. He didn't speak about death like it was a distant possibility. He spoke about it like it had a name and a schedule and a promise to keep. And still, he didn't slow down. He accelerated. Like someone burning every second of daylight before the darkness caught up. In the studio, there was no wasted breath, no indulgence. He wasn't trying to please radio. He was trying to leave behind a living ghost, a voice that could stand on its own, one that could still speak for him after the news cycle moved on. And that's exactly what it became. Because even now the world listens to Tupac not just as a rapper, but as a prophet, as someone who saw the future, not in some mystical way, but in the realest way possible, by studying the system and understanding exactly how it would end him, and how it would try to erase him afterward. But it couldn't, because he was too loud, because he recorded too much, because he knew, because somewhere inside him, he understood that his real life wouldn't be lived on this side of the timeline, but in the echoes, in the lessons, in the recordings left behind like breadcrumbs for the ones coming after. He knew he was running out of time, so he built something that would outlast the ticking. He left behind not just music, but memory. Not just an album, but a map. Not just a message, but a mirror. And it still reflects, still burns, still speaks, Because when you create like you're dying, the work becomes immortal. Tupac was not just trying to stay alive, he was trying to be remembered right. He understood the machine. He saw how artists became symbols, how symbols got sanitized, and how sanitized legends stopped being dangerous. And Tupac, he never wanted to be safe. Not in life, and certainly not in memory. That's why he didn't wait to be mythologized. He crafted his myth while still breathing, and he made sure it was too complex to flatten, too alive to cage. That's why his songs from those final months are so layered. They sound like confessions and manifestos all at once. There's rage in them, yes. Fury at the state, at betrayal, at the trap set by power. But there's also a tiredness, a weight. You can hear the strain of someone who has spent his entire youth fighting battles just to stay visible. Someone who learned too early that genius and vulnerability don't buy you protection. They just make you more of a target. And yet, he refused to hide the soft parts. Even in his most aggressive verses, there are lines that crack open. Suddenly, unexpectedly, letting light through. Mentions of his mother, his childhood, his loneliness. You get the sense, listening closely, that he wasn't trying to be a leader. He was trying to survive himself, trying to understand where all the pain was supposed to go, trying to leave a record in case no one ever asked him the right questions. He once said he was writing for the kid in the ghetto with no future, no hope, no father. He was trying to speak to that boy, because he was that boy. And part of him always would be. No amount of platinum records could untangle that trauma. No amount of fans could silence the echo of gunshots or the sound of prison gates clanking shut. Tupac carried his wounds like ink. They marked every bar, every hook, every line, not just as scars, but as testimony. That's why his music hits differently. It's not just that it sounds urgent, it was urgent. He wasn't writing from the studio. He was writing from the edge, from a life so narrow, so pressurized, that every track felt like a last breath held too long. And he didn't want to die quietly. He didn't want to be another black man erased and eulogized by people who never tried to understand him. He wanted his name to mean something, not just fame, not just controversy. Meaning, something deeper, something lasting, something dangerous. So he layered his verses with truth bombs, wrote about police brutality before it became a hashtag, called out corrupt systems before it was considered brave, spoke about the prison industrial complex, about generational pain, about racism, masculinity, capitalism, freedom, and how none of it ever touched the people it promised to protect. He was a rapper, yes, but he was also a witness, a reporter, a son, a brother, a man afraid of being forgotten before anyone truly saw him. That fear of being silenced drove the work. That fear became fuel. And in the end, it became prophecy. Because now, all these years later, the world still plays his voice, still tries to figure him out, still quotes him, debates him, wears his face on shirts and tattoos his lyrics into skin. They made murals of him on buildings that once turned him away. Schools use his poems in classrooms. Academics study his interviews. And yet, no one can pin him down. That was his design. To be unkillable through message. Unbottled through sound. He said he might not change the world, but he would spark the mind that would. He did. But he did more than that too. He left a body of work recorded in the shadow of death, but aimed at the future. He wrote like a man with minutes left. He spoke like the world might end tomorrow. He rapped like the grave was listening. And he made sure no matter what happened, he'd still be heard. Even in death, Tupac was never still. His name didn't vanish into memory, it expanded. It moved through speakers and streets, through protests and playlists, through headphones on late-night subway rides and classrooms filled with students who weren't born when he died. His presence didn't quiet, it multiplied. And that's because of those final days, those final sessions, that final flood of sound and urgency. Tupac recorded not just to express himself, but to outlive himself. And he succeeded. He knew exactly what would happen. He predicted it, in line after line. He knew they'd try to water him down, sell his pain back to the world in box sets and compilations. He knew the press would retroactively sanitize him, call him complicated instead of dangerous, troubled instead of honest. But he also knew that he had said enough, recorded enough, revealed enough that the truth couldn't be erased entirely. He had made too many people feel something. And feeling, real, visceral, unshakable feeling is harder to manipulate than facts. What he left behind wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. He forced America to look at itself, at its promises and prisons, at the beauty and brutality it creates, at the young men it praises in music videos and cages in real life, at the way black genius is both desired and feared. Tupac made music that didn't just slap, it interrupted, it broke the mood, it demanded attention, and he knew exactly how dangerous that was. That's why he worked the way he did. That's why the studio lights stayed on through the night. That's why there are vaults full of his voice, even now. Because he wasn't chasing peace. He was chasing immortality through clarity, through volume. He didn't want there to be a moment where the world could say he left nothing behind. He left everything behind, even the parts he wasn't sure about, even the verses that weren't perfect, even the drafts of thoughts he hadn't yet figured out how to finish. Because he knew the silence was coming. And when it did, what remained was sound, his voice, urgent, defiant, trembling with truth. Not a product, not a brand, a man, still fighting even after the fight was over. That's why it still hurts to listen, not because of nostalgia, but because of knowing. Knowing he wasn't finished. Knowing he was just starting to crack open something deeper, something bigger than music. And yet, he somehow did enough, more than enough. He created a foundation that still stands, still shakes, still speaks, still wakes people up. Tupac's last days were not spent in retreat. They were spent in creation. Not out of peace, but out of purpose. He didn't leave a will, he left warnings. He didn't leave a memoir. He left verses, blueprints, signals, buried truths wrapped in rhyme, and he did it like he didn't have another day. Because he knew he might not, and still, he gave us everything. So now, we remember him not just as a rapper, or a poet, or a rebel, but as a man who refused to die quietly, as a man who recorded faster than fate, as a man who turned his final days into forever. There's something holy about the way Tupac refused to let silence define him. In those final months, he understood that history is often written not by the ones who lived it, but by those who survived them. And he wasn't going to allow his life to be archived by strangers who never knew his voice, only his name. So he flooded the world with evidence, with proof. Every beat he touched became a time capsule. Every verse, a blood oath. Every late-night studio session, a whispered defiance against the casket he saw coming. And maybe that's why it still feels like he's around. Not in some romanticized way, but in a real, haunting, present sense. Like he's watching from just outside the frame. Because when someone leaves that much of themselves behind, they don't disappear. They echo, and Tupac made sure his echo would be too loud to fade. His death didn't pause the movement, it ignited it. His music only got louder. His face, painted across murals and tattooed on bodies, became less of a memory and more of a warning. Don't mistake survival for peace. Don't confuse presence with justice. His legacy was built not on how long he lived, but on how urgently he did everything in the time he had. And there's no better example of that urgency than his recording sessions at Death Row. Every day he clocked in like a man racing the hourglass. He didn't rest on hits, he outpaced them. His producers described it like trying to keep up with a storm. He'd write on the spot, record in one take, and move on before the beat even finished rendering. It wasn't about finesse. It was about getting it out, making sure the message wasn't buried inside him if the bullets came too soon. Because deep down, he wasn't just making music. He was leaving instructions. Not instructions for how to be famous, but for how to survive while being black, poor, angry, brilliant, vulnerable, and hunted. His lyrics were blueprints for self-respect in a world that demanded submission. He wasn't just rapping. He was archiving his soul for people who would need it long after he was gone. And that's why the unfinished quality of some of those songs, the rawness, the fury, the unpolished edges, feels more powerful than any polished masterpiece. Because they weren't created for comfort. They were created for truth, and the truth doesn't always rhyme. The truth doesn't always end cleanly. Sometimes it ends in a car on a Vegas street, with a sky too quiet and a legacy just starting to rise. Tupac never begged to be remembered. He dared us to remember him correctly. Not as a thug, not as a martyr, not as a myth, but as a man. A man who cried, a man who fought, a man who wrote until his hands ached and his voice cracked and the studio doors had to be locked behind him. A man who loved hard and hurt harder. A man who knew that time would betray him, so he betrayed time first. By leaving so much of himself behind, it would take generations to unpack it all. We're still unpacking, still listening, still finding lines that feel like they were written yesterday, because they were. The world just hadn't caught up yet. And that's the final magic of Tupac. He didn't just leave behind music, he left behind timelessness. Work that feels like prophecy because it was built on lived reality. He didn't predict the future. He simply told the truth so clearly, so fearlessly, that the future had no choice but to prove him right. So when you press play on those tracks, especially the ones recorded near the end, you're not just hearing a song. You're hearing a man running out of time and making every second eternal. In the end, Tupac didn't die in silence. He died in motion. He died with verses still in his head, albums still in his veins, songs still waiting to be born. He didn't get a clean exit. No farewell tour, no reflective interviews in soft lighting, no final performance where the crowd knew to say goodbye. His ending came fast, violent, and unfinished, just like so many of his rhymes. But he knew that might happen. He lived like a man who had already buried versions of himself. And so, instead of waiting for peace, he worked. There's something sacred about that labor, about showing up in the studio every night, not because the label demanded it, but because your spirit couldn't rest. About writing verses not as entertainment, but as resistance. Tupac understood the power of being remembered on your own terms. And that's exactly what those final days were about. He wasn't just outpacing death. He was building a fortress of sound that it couldn't reach. And that fortress still stands. You hear it in every line he spit in those last months. There's breathlessness in it. Not desperation, awareness. An artist who knew he was writing in red ink, carving his legacy in real time with no second draft. Even when the content wasn't political, the act of creation was. Just the act of being a black man. Refusing erasure, refusing to be silenced, refusing to become what the industry wanted, that was radical. Tupac was burning through tape because he wanted to leave behind enough that nobody could shut him up once his voice was gone. And now his voice shows up in places he never walked, in movements he never saw, in young people who were born years after he was buried. That's not coincidence. That's intention. He wrote for them. He said so himself. I'm not saying I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee I will spark the brain that will. That spark, it's still catching fire. In poets who feel too raw to be published. In kids who feel too angry to be peaceful. In young black men who are told they're too emotional to survive. In anyone who has something to say but no place to say it. Tupac gave them language, gave them permission, gave them proof. That's why his legacy is not measured in Grammys or charts. It's measured in impact and how often his name is whispered when justice is denied, and how many people still carry his words on their skin, in their playlists, in their hearts. He's not frozen in 1996. He's ongoing. He's still being decoded, still being heard, still being felt, because the man knew. He knew time would betray him. He knew loyalty could fail. He knew power could be stolen. But truth could echo. And so he made truth his home. He didn't live to be safe. He didn't live to be idolized. He lived to testify, to write verses that doubled his last words, to make beats bleed, to name his enemies, praise his people, and leave nothing unsaid. His verses weren't entertainment. They were confessions, screams, prayers, warnings. He filled every line with the weight of someone who'd already seen the end and decided to speak from inside it. Tupac didn't record to be famous. He was already that. He recorded to be understood. And in doing so, he made something more powerful than music. He made memory louder than silence. He made death answer to him. He made time run out of excuses. And now, long after his final breath, he is still talking. Still telling us what it meant to carry too much truth in a world that only wanted rhythm. Still proving that if you make art like you're running out of time, you won't just outlive your enemies, you'll outlive the clock itself. Tupac didn't run out of time. He turned time into a weapon. And it's still firing. Tupac Shakur did not drift into history. He carved his way into it, track by track, breath by breath, knowing full well that time was not a luxury he'd be granted. In those final months, he wasn't just recording music, he was engraving his soul into the walls of time, clawing at the silence before it could take him. There was no gentleness in it, no calm reflection, no slow unraveling. There was only work, constant, unrelenting, fevered work. He recorded like a man who knew the clock wasn't ticking anymore. It was screaming, and still, he didn't flinch. He poured himself into the booth with the urgency of someone trying to build a monument before the ground gave way beneath him. This wasn't industry hustle. It wasn't the grind for chart toppers or marketing campaigns. It was something far more primal. Tupac was trying to leave behind a version of himself that couldn't be killed. Something too loud to bury, too honest to corrupt. He didn't care if the verses were messy or the beats were raw. He wasn't polishing a legacy. He was leaving behind proof of life. And every line he spat in that studio carried the weight of finality. Not because he wanted to die, but because he refused to be forgotten in pieces. He wanted the whole story out there. Rage and joy. Violence and love. The contradictions. The hurt. The clarity that came from growing up with a target on your chest and a war in your blood. Tupac didn't trust the world to protect his story. He saw what it did to people like him. Black men with power, with poetry, with volume. They get boxed in, silenced, rewritten. He was never going to let that happen quietly. So he wrote like a man possessed, not by ego, but by the desperate need to outlive erasure. His voice was his resistance. His music was his last will and testament. And instead of one final letter, he left hundreds. Not sweetened for public consumption, not rounded at the edges. He wanted you to hear the chaos, the pressure, the knowing. And if you listen to those songs, especially the ones made in the weeks before he was killed, you hear something deeper than music. You hear reckoning. You hear a man who's reached the edge and instead of turning back, starts shouting into the abyss. There's prophecy in the way his tone sharpens. Like he's recording for an audience that hasn't even been born yet. Because he wasn't just making tracks, he was sending messages into the future, stacking them like bricks against the storm he knew was coming. Each verse a flare, a warning, a memory secured in sound. He wasn't perfect. He knew that. He embraced it. His music was a mirror, cracked and unfiltered. He didn't try to be a role model. He tried to be real. And real people don't come clean. They come messy, loud, exhausted, half-healed. That's what he gave. Not some airbrushed version of greatness, but the raw material of survival. He bled into the mic because it was the only way to keep from disappearing under someone else's narrative. And that blood, those words, those beats, they're still running. Even now, we're still catching up to what he laid down. The layers in his lyrics, the anger in his voice, the love buried under the fury. He lived fast because life never gave him the option to slow down. He recorded like he knew the days were numbered. He created with the heat of someone who'd seen too much too early and refused to die quiet. And when death finally came, it didn't stop him. Because the man died, but the voice multiplied. Tupac didn't just leave a legacy, he left instructions. For how to stay loud, how to fight, how to grieve, how to love even when everything's burning. His music wasn't designed to fade out with the charts, it was built to haunt. And it does. Not as nostalgia, not as a golden age, but as a living, breathing force, a testimony carved into tape. And that's why his last days matter, because they weren't his descent. They were his sprint, his uprising, his last urgent scream before the silence could win. And in that scream, he made something time couldn't touch, something still vibrating through walls, through bodies, through generations. He didn't run out of time. He turned time into his echo. Tupac's life was never linear. It bent, burned, twisted, part poetry, part tragedy, all intensity. For every moment of triumph, there was a shadow close behind. A new betrayal. A new courtroom. A new scar. His rise wasn't smooth. It was jagged. Made of sudden turns and violent bursts, like someone climbing a mountain that kept trying to swallow him whole. And through all of it, he kept moving, kept writing, kept recording. Because the dramas weren't interruptions, they were the conditions of his life. Tupac didn't create in spite of chaos, he created through it, with it, because of it. From the beginning, drama chased him. His lineage was resistance. His mother, Afeni Shakur, fought the federal government while pregnant with him. The FBI had a file on his family before he was even born. He didn't grow up dreaming of stages. He grew up surviving. His adolescence was marked by hunger, evictions, and a sense that he didn't fully belong anywhere. He moved constantly, carried trauma from city to city, changed schools, identities, realities. By the time he landed in Baltimore, where he studied acting and poetry, he was already wearing a mask that the world would soon mistake for his face. Sharp-tongued, loud, confrontational. But underneath there was always the writer, the thinker, the boy who read Shakespeare to make sense of his mother's pain. His early fame came quickly and violently. He didn't ease into the spotlight. He exploded into it. Tupacalypse Now wasn't just an album. It was a public threat to the system. Politicians condemned him. Police unions called for boycotts. And Tupac, still barely in his 20s, found himself at the center of a storm he'd helped create, but couldn't yet control. That storm only grew louder. In 1993, a young woman accused him of sexual assault, a charge that Tupac denied to his last breath, insisting the encounter had been consensual, but that he was guilty of failing to protect her from others in his circle. He was convicted, sentenced to prison. That moment marked a brutal shift, not just in his public image, but in his soul. Behind bars, Tupac was fractured, angry, confused, betrayed. He read, wrote, reflected, but he was also watching his name become less his own and more a symbol, misunderstood, used, feared. Then came the shooting. 5 bullets. A New York recording studio. November 30th, 1994. Tupac, on his way to trial, was ambushed in the lobby and shot multiple times. He survived, barely. But the damage went deeper than the wounds. He believed, knew, that people close to him had set him up. Friends he trusted, peers he admired. That's when the paranoia set in. That's when his music started sounding more like prophecy and less like entertainment. That's when he stopped being just an artist and became a man on fire. He signed with Death Row Records while still in prison. Suge Knight paid his bail. And when Tupac came out, he didn't come back gentle. He returned with All Eyes on Me, a double album that sounded like war. Not just against his enemies, but against the clock, against fate. The beats were harder, the verses tighter, the shadows longer. And still, the drama followed. East Coast, West Coast, Bad Boy, Death Row. The media played it like sport. But for Tupac, it wasn't a game. It was life. Real people were dying. Real loyalty was shifting. He had beef with Biggie, with Puffy, with almost anyone who he thought had betrayed him or stayed silent when he was bleeding. His lyrics named names. His interviews pulled no punches. There was no filter. No peace. Just the sound of a man who felt like he was surrounded on all sides and decided to go out screaming instead of hiding. People say Tupac was angry, but they forget where that anger came from. It wasn't just bravado, it was betrayal, loss, disillusionment. The very systems and people he once trusted, the media, the courts, the industry, even friends, had shown him their fangs. So he built armor with his voice. He turned the studio into a war room. He put his fears into rhyme and sharpened them into weapons. Yet, through all of it, the trials, the threats, the disses, the demons, he still found time to be beautiful. To write about mothers, children, dreams, God, love, survival. That's what made him different. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He didn't clean himself up for the spotlight. He showed us everything. The genius and the recklessness, the softness and the rage, the street and the spirit. In those final weeks, Tupac knew the walls were closing in. He spoke about death too clearly for it to be coincidence. He moved with the edge of a man who didn't expect to see 30. And still, he showed up. Still went to the studio. Still poured verse after verse into the mic like it was the only thing keeping him from disappearing. He had already buried too many friends. Already felt the grip of death too many times. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being misunderstood. So he recorded until he couldn't. Because he knew, once he was gone, they'd try to reshape him. Try to call him just a gangster. Just a problem. Just another statistic. But Tupac had already told his story in his words. Already left behind enough truth to drown out the lies. Already made enough noise to be heard forever. He didn't want to be remembered as perfect. He wanted to be remembered as real. And in that, he never failed. That realness, raw, flawed, unfiltered, was both his greatest power and his heaviest burden. Tupac didn't know how to fake it. He didn't want to. And the world wasn't built to hold someone like that, without trying to break them. He wasn't interested in playing safe, in smoothing his edges for acceptance. He walked into every room carrying his whole truth, whether people wanted it or not. And that made him dangerous, not because he was violent, but because he was honest. And honesty like that doesn't sit comfortably in a world full of masks. It provokes, it disrupts, it challenges the narratives that people use to protect themselves. Tupac was never just talking about himself, he was exposing systems. He was naming the things that most people only whisper about. Racism, poverty, injustice, trauma, betrayal, masculinity, vulnerability, the prison pipeline, the weight of survival when your life has always been considered disposable. He lived at the intersection of all those things, and he refused to shut up about any of it. But the world doesn't reward that kind of honesty. It punishes it. It isolates it. And that's what happened to Tupac. Even as his fame skyrocketed, even as his records shattered expectations, he was more alone than ever, surrounded by noise, yet constantly misunderstood. Fans adored him, but few knew him. Friends turned into enemies. Support turned into surveillance. The paranoia people accused him of wasn't a delusion. It was a reaction. Because when you've been betrayed once, you start to see ghosts everywhere. And Tupac had been betrayed too many times to keep pretending it was safe to trust. So he turned inward. But not in silence. He turned inward through work. The studio became the one place where he didn't have to explain himself. Where he could pour out every contradiction, every wound, every prophecy, and let the mic absorb what the world couldn't. That's why those final recordings are so electric. They carry the weight of isolation, but they also sound like freedom. And not because he was free, but because the act of speaking was freedom in itself. He didn't stop to ask whether the world was ready to hear him. He made them ready. And even when the words came out sharp, broken, furious, there was always something underneath. A current of sadness, a sense of inevitability. Like he knew this was his last transmission. Like he was trying to tell us everything at once, in case he didn't get another chance. And he didn't. That's the most haunting part. He didn't get to grow old, didn't get to explain himself, didn't get to evolve in public the way so many other artists do. He was frozen at 25, half prophet, half rebel, all flame. And we never got to see what he might have become. Would he have mellowed? Would he have burned even brighter? We'll never know. All we have is the music, the footage, the interviews, the glimpses of brilliance wrapped in urgency. But maybe that's what he wanted. not to be remembered as a perfect arc, but as a rupture. A blast of truth that didn't wait for approval, a voice that refused to be smoothed out. He wasn't here to make people comfortable. He was here to wake them up. And he did. That's why his name still means something. Not just to hip-hop. Not just to black culture. To anyone who has ever felt like they were running out of time, but had too much left to say. To anyone who has ever tried to leave behind something that couldn't be erased. To anyone who has ever tried to make their pain into a map. Tupac didn't live a life that followed the rules. He broke them. He didn't want to fit into the box, he wanted to set it on fire. And that fire is still burning. The fire Tupac lit wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. It burned through categories, through expectations, through every box they tried to fit him in. He wasn't just a rapper, or an actor, or a revolutionary, or a martyr. He was all of it, at once, often in the same breath. That's what made him powerful. That's what made him dangerous. Because systems survive by simplifying people, by reducing them to a single version that's easier to market, easier to blame, easier to forget. But Tupac didn't give the world that comfort. He refused to settle for being one thing. In his music, you heard 1,000 selves. The son, the soldier, the student, the sinner, the saint. One moment he was calling out the system with laser precision. Cops give a damn about a Negro? Pull the trigger, kill a nigga, he's a hero. And the next he was writing Dear Mama, a love letter so intimate it felt like it was never meant for public ears. He let the duality stand. He let it exist. He didn't clean it up for anybody. That's what made him more than an artist. That's what made him real. Because real people aren't consistent. They're honest. And honesty, when it's sharp enough, starts to look like prophecy. Because Tupac saw what was coming. Not just for himself, but for the culture. He saw how the music industry would co-opt the struggle. How record labels would sell black pain as entertainment, while offering no protection to the people who lived it. He saw how the streets would eat their young. How the prisons would keep filling. How the politicians would keep smiling through it all. He wasn't shocked by injustice. He expected it. He named it. And he made sure his lyrics were laced with that awareness. But that kind of vision takes a toll. Especially when you're carrying it alone. Especially when you're 23, 24, 25 years old and expected to be not just a voice, but a movement. Especially when everyone wants something from you. Labels, crews, fans, enemies, allies, and no one is asking if you're okay. Tupac wasn't just battling external pressure, he was battling internal war. Depression, anger, mistrust, exhaustion. The pressure to keep performing, to keep fighting, to keep proving he was bigger than his past, bigger than his sentence, bigger than the bullets that had already torn through his flesh once. So he worked, non-stop. Not because he had energy to spare, but because stopping meant sitting in the quiet. And the quiet is where the ghosts get loud. He recorded like a man possessed, like someone who knew that death wasn't a concept. It was a calendar event, with a to-do list. So he left as much as he could behind. Not for praise, not for money, but for clarity, for the record. So there'd be no question about who he was or what he stood for. The irony is that in trying to protect his story, he became a symbol. And symbols too often get flattened. They become t-shirts and slogans and quotes without context. But Tupac wasn't meant to be consumed, he was meant to be understood. And that understanding only comes when you sit with the full weight of his work. The contradictions, the beauty, the violence, the brokenness, the love, the insight, the fear, all of it. Because he gave all of it, and that's why the work lives on, not just in playlists, but in hearts, in movements, in conversations about what it means to be free, what it means to be seen, what it means to speak even when your voice shakes. Tupac never asked for sainthood. He asked for truth. He demanded space for complexity. And in doing so, he gave us more than music. He gave us a mirror, a map, a challenge, and maybe that's the real legacy, not how he died, but how he refused to disappear quietly. Even in his absence, Tupac continues to confront us. Not gently, not politely. He confronts us with everything we try to ignore. The weight of poverty, the machinery of racism, The betrayal of systems that promise justice but deliver silence. He doesn't let us look away. His voice, decades later, still cuts through the noise of new headlines and shallow discourse. Because what he was talking about wasn't just relevant, it was foundational. He wasn't reacting to a moment. He was documenting a condition. And that's why his words still sting, still resonate, still feel like they were written today. He didn't record songs for the season. He recorded scripture for the suffering, not the kind of suffering you clean up for sympathy, but the kind you live with every day, in your bones, in your skin, in your decisions. He wasn't just giving testimony. He was giving instructions. How to be black and still feel joy. How to be poor and still feel powerful. How to be broken and still speak like a king. His songs weren't always polished, but they were sacred. You can hear it in the breath between bars, in the fury behind the calm, in the way he kept speaking even when no one was listening the way he needed them to. And he didn't stop with music. That's what people forget. He was reading political theory while writing Hail Mary. He was quoting Machiavelli while watching his back in hotel hallways. He was studying revolution and organizing prison reform strategies while still carrying the street on his shoulders. He wasn't interested in being one kind of smart or one kind of strong. He understood that his influence wasn't just cultural, it was tactical. He wanted to disrupt the system, not through slogans, but through sustained truth. Truth in art, truth in life, truth in death. And even when he leaned into the chaos, when he raged, when he lashed out, when he contradicted himself, it was never without intention. Tupac was human, but he was also aware that he was being watched, that his image was being shaped and reshaped in real time. He talked about it constantly, how the media made monsters, how the same press that covered his rise would feast on his fall. He wasn't paranoid. He was documenting, predicting, responding, and always recording. Because in the end, the work was the only thing he could control. Not the headlines, not the legal system, not the threats, but the work, the songs, the verses, the tapes. That's where he could speak without interruption. That's where he could pour his rage and love and sadness and defiance into something that couldn't be taken from him once he was gone. And that's what we're left with now. Not a ghost, but a record. A library of fire. A blueprint for how to live when your life has been devalued by the world around you. Tupac knew they would try to rewrite him. So he wrote everything down first. He didn't just leave music, he left evidence. He didn't just leave verses, he left verdicts. He didn't just leave rhymes, he left resistance. And if you truly want to know who he was, you have to sit with the full weight of that. Not the edited version, not the myth. The man, the boy who never stopped hurting. The poet who never stopped speaking. The fighter who never stopped recording, because recording was the only way he could make sure his voice would keep moving through time, even after the bullets came. That's what makes his story so powerful, not just how he lived, but how hard he worked to outlive the lie that young black men die and vanish. He didn't vanish. And every time someone presses play on his voice, on a dusty cassette, a streaming link, a scratched CD in a secondhand car stereo, Tupac lives again. Not as a memory, but as an interruption. He interrupts the comfort of forgetting. He breaks through the noise with that unmistakable tone, half sermon, half street corner fire, and demands to be heard as he was, not as the softened legend, not as the posthumous icon, but as a living contradiction. A man filled with love and fury, brilliance and scars, clarity and chaos. Tupac was never easy to define, because he never wanted to be. He wanted to reflect something, not represent it. And what he reflected was the full, unfiltered experience of being young, black, and awake in a world built to dull you down. The world tried to clip his wings, but Tupac turned his wounds into wings instead. Turned betrayal into albums, turned fear into momentum. He never claimed to be perfect. In fact, he insisted he wasn't. But he was real, and that authenticity became more powerful than polish. He wasn't interested in redemption arcs. He didn't wait to be forgiven or understood. He gave you the whole picture. The rage, the sorrow, the confusion, the moments of quiet hope that somehow bloomed amid the gunshots and flashing cameras. When he was accused of being a thug, he didn't shrink away. He flipped it. Thug life wasn't just a phrase. It was a code. It stood for the pain inherited by the poor, for the young who grow up quicker than they should, for those who carry a weight that was never meant to be theirs. Tupac turned what the world labeled him into a doctrine, a shield, a flag. And in doing so, he gave generations a vocabulary for their anger, their beauty, their survival. He took what was thrown at him and made it sacred. And behind the hardness, there was always softness. That's what so many missed then, and still miss now. Tupac didn't scream because he hated everything. He screamed because he loved so much it hurt. He loved black women. He loved his people. He loved truth. He loved justice. He believed in things deeply, even when the world gave him nothing but reasons to be numb. His compassion was often buried under steel, but it was there, in every line about his mother, in every verse where he dared to be vulnerable in a genre that rarely allowed it. And that love didn't fade in his final days. It intensified. That's why he kept recording. Not just for immortality, but for intimacy, for connection, for those who might one day need to hear someone say the things they couldn't yet name. He didn't just want to be remembered, he wanted to be felt. And he still is. Not because he was perfect, but because he was true. Because he let us see him rage and cry and fight and dream, sometimes all in the same song. Because he left behind not just music, but a trail. A way to walk through the fire and still speak. A way to live loudly, even when the world begs you to go quiet. So no, Tupac didn't fade away. He cut through time. He didn't die to become a myth. He lived so fiercely that death couldn't even hold him. And that voice, hoarse, heavy, fearless, still floats through rooms, still rattles inside speakers, still pulls people closer, still tells the truth in ways that textbooks and headlines never will. Because in the end, Tupac didn't just leave art. He left a pulse. And it's still beating. That pulse is everywhere now, quiet but constant, like a second heartbeat running beneath the culture. You feel it in the cadence of new MCs who grew up mouthing his words before they understood their meaning. You see it in murals on cracked brick walls, eyes lifted to skies he never lived to walk under. You hear it at protests, in chants that echo his fury. You read it in essays, in poetry, in courtrooms, in classrooms. Because Tupac didn't just leave behind albums. He left behind permission. To feel deeply. To fight loudly. To break open. To carry contradiction without shame. And maybe that's his greatest gift. That he allowed us to hold multiple truths at once. That you could be angry and still hopeful. That you could speak of vengeance in one breath and of forgiveness in the next. That you could write about shooting and dying and heaven and love and your mama. And none of it would be fake. None of it had to be hidden. He gave voice to every part of the human condition that doesn't fit inside clean narratives. He said the unsayable. He showed the unshowable. And he did it publicly, knowing the price. Because there was always a price. For being that open, that loud, that visible. The world doesn't reward that kind of truth. It punishes it. Tupac knew it. He had already been in courtrooms, in hospital beds, in cells. He had watched friends die. He had tasted betrayal from people who once called him brother. He knew the end wasn't a matter of if but when, and still he kept speaking. He weaponized his vulnerability, not to protect himself, but to arm others, to remind people that being broken didn't mean being defeated, that surviving wasn't always noble or clean. Sometimes it was loud, messy, violent. But survival was still a form of rebellion, especially when the odds were designed to make you disappear. So he turned his voice into armor, into scripture, into a living archive that could survive what he could not. He gave us hundreds of verses, thousands of bars, countless pieces of himself stitched into rhythm. He didn't wait for approval. He didn't need validation. The music wasn't a career move, it was a testament. And every track felt like it was recorded under the gun, not because of paranoia, but because of urgency. Because he knew that truth delayed is truth denied. And yet, even with all the fire, all the war, all the weight, there was still space in his work for softness, for beauty, for a strange kind of grace. In a genre often dominated by bravado, Tupac left space for grief, for uncertainty, for prayer. He wasn't afraid to speak to God or to challenge him. He didn't just write to be heard, he wrote to understand. Himself, the world, his mother, his enemies, his loneliness, his love. And that's why the songs don't age, they stay present. Because the emotions that fueled them, fear, longing, betrayal, courage, never go out of season. They're human. And Tupac was nothing if not achingly human. So when people ask why he still matters, why his name still echoes louder than artists with twice the discography and none of the scars, the answer is simple. Because he meant it. Every word, every flaw, every verse that sounded more like a last breath than a performance. He didn't rap for awards. He rapped like someone trying to save their soul. And maybe yours too. And he did save people. He still does. In bedrooms, on sidewalks, in silence. His voice arrives when you need it. Not polished, not saintly, but true. And in this world, truth is the rarest sound of all. That's the echo. That's the gift. That's the pulse. Still beating. Still loud. Still Tupac. Tupac was not built to be timeless in the way the industry defines it. He was built to be unavoidable. And in that, he transcended every attempt to box him in. The world tried to define him as a rapper, a thug, a criminal, a martyr, a rebel. But he cracked open those definitions from the inside. He was a man who refused to be reduced. A man who didn't just move through culture, he split it open. His presence didn't decorate a moment in history, it complicated it. Made it impossible to ignore the questions we still struggle to answer. What does it cost to be seen? What does it take to speak? Who gets to survive truth? Tupac didn't die for the music, he lived through the music, he used it as a sword, a shield, a letter home. It was his only safe place, even as it became the most public part of his life. It's in those final recordings, raw, half-mixed, sometimes unfinished, that you feel the weight he carried. Not just the weight of his own pain, but the weight of everyone's pain. Of a generation growing up under surveillance, under threat, under pressure to be either invisible or entertaining. Tupac refused both. He carved space for himself in a world that wasn't built to hold him. And when he ran out of room, he recorded more. When his circle tightened, when betrayal started wearing familiar faces, when the industry began to feel like a trap instead of a platform, he recorded more. That's how he survived. Not through comfort, through output, through creation, through a kind of urgent generosity, giving the world what was breaking him, because if he didn't, he knew the silence would finish the job. And still, he smiled, still danced, still laughed with friends in between verses, still carried his notebooks like gospel, still went to interviews ready to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone like him. That's the thing people forget when they reduce him to a symbol. Tupac was alive, complex, funny, exhausted, full of stories and contradictions and sudden, sharp insight that made you realize you weren't just dealing with talent, you were dealing with consciousness. He saw everything. He studied the game and exposed it at the same time. He played with it, mocked it, obeyed it when he had to, and then broke its rules when they threatened to define him. You hear it in every album, the tug of war between wanting to belong and knowing he never could, between needing love and preparing for violence, between fame and the fear that fame was just another form of surveillance. And in the end, what he left us wasn't closure. It was challenge. He didn't wrap his life into a lesson. He handed it to us, messy, urgent, and asked, "What are you going to do with this? With this pain, this rage, this voice, this clarity?" Because Tupac didn't record to be remembered. He recorded to provoke, to demand, to echo. That's why he doesn't fade. That's why his name still lives in verses, From artists who owe him more than influence, they owe him permission to speak how they speak, to hurt out loud, to imagine beyond survival. He taught them that. He taught us that. And even now, all these years later, we're still catching up to the truth he already gave us. Still hearing new meaning in lines we thought we understood. Still grieving a man who told us how he would be taken. Still feeling his presence, not like a ghost, but like a shadow we walk beside. Because Tupac wasn't preparing for death. He was preparing us to live louder, to live freer, to live honestly. And that may be the most radical thing of all. ChatGPT said, Tupac's story doesn't end in a flash of headlines or in the weight of a tombstone. It doesn't end on a Las Vegas street or in a studio vault packed with verses that never saw daylight. His story continues in every voice that dares to speak truth, in every beat that carries fire, in every person who chooses to be unfiltered in a world addicted to performance. He didn't die as a symbol. He lived as a mirror, one that reflected our deepest wounds, our wildest hopes, our contradictions, our brilliance, our rage. He reminded us that you don't have to be perfect to be powerful, that your voice is worth using even if it trembles, that survival itself can be a kind of resistance. He left behind a map, not to peace, but to purpose, not to comfort, but to clarity. And he followed that path all the way to the edge. He ran out of time, yes, but he made sure we didn't run out of him. He left his voice everywhere, in speakers, in streets, in hearts, in history. And maybe, in the end, that's the only kind of immortality that matters. Now let the night fall gently, let the noise fade, the memories settle, and let the sound of his voice dissolve into quiet. You've walked through the storm. You've stood in the firelight of a soul that refused to dim. You have heard the urgency. Now hear the stillness. Good night. Sleep well. And enjoy the soothing sound of crackling fire.